Our next reader, been here many times. She had written novels, she had written plays, memoirs, very talented, as soon you will see. If you want to know more about her work, you can go to www.deirdresinnott.com. That's D-E?
D-E, like weird, DeirdreSinnott.com.
So give her a big hand, please.
Well, thank you, Victoria, and thank you to all who came up here and gave us their poems. I really enjoyed hearing them. They're very inspirational, and the music was just great. And Phoebe, wow, I'm blown away. I have no poetry for you, I'm afraid. This is from my upcoming novel called The Third Mrs. Galway, and it's set in Utica, New York in 1835. And just a warning that the language is from 1835, and so sometimes it's a little bit offensive, or very offensive. Okay. Prologue. The frigid October rain somehow found the opening between Amari's bonnet and the shawl she had bundled around her neck. Streaks of water slipped down her skin, soaking her blouse. The moisture, pushed by the constant arrival of new droplets, spread through the fabric to the high waistband of her skirt and inched across her protruding belly. She felt heavy, weighed down by the miles and the baby inside her. It kicked and stretched. Poor Mike, gotta be feeling as bad as I do, she thought. Last night, when she and her boy Joe had started, she figured they had plenty of time to reach Utica before the sun came up. Over the months, she had carried herself and her infant through muddy swamps, over mountains, and into the gloomiest woods. And by this point, Joe had grown used to being silent and watchful. Today's 14 miles shouldn't have been a problem. 5 or 6 hours of keeping to the Erie Canal's perfectly smooth, flat towpath, and hiding when they passed mule teams pulling boats. But her legs were weak, and the baby wouldn't settle. And the new day had arrived under purple-black clouds and stinging cold showers. As they reached the outskirts of town, they got off the towpath to look for the wide creek that led to the house they sought. A gust of wind pushed her back on her heels. She grabbed her son to steady herself. "Where we at? I lost count." "We passed 7 buildings and 4 streets," he said, holding his straw hat on his head. "We did?" She rested her arm across his thin shoulders and looked around. "Thank the Lord your daddy taught you your numbers." "It gotta be that one there," he said, pointing to a group of nested buildings in the corner of the block. Flying leaves pelted them as they stood. Lightning flashed, and for a moment the house, barn, and outbuildings looked like they were standing in the noonday sun. A deafening clap of thunder made her flinch and cry in surprise. A horse whinnied. "We gotta get inside. Let me lean on you." She struggled to the corner of the barn and peeked around. "That there shed looks like it ain't been touched for a while. Them weeds have grown tall. That's the place." A bolt of lightning flashed, its bony fingers disappearing as quickly as they came. "Let's go," she said, gripping him. She glanced at the property. The shed is too close to the house, she thought, but this baby ain't giving me no choice. In a few painful steps they were inside. She leaned on a table, trying to stay on her feet. Her knees weakened. She felt her balance go as she tried to right herself. She swept clay pots and gardening tools to the floor. "Mama!" the boy cried. He went to his knees, catching her and easing her to the ground. "Good boy," she said, panting as the thunder rattled the dusty windows. "Now pull that door closed tight. Careful now, don't get seen." When his back was turned, she shivered. Joe sat beside her. "You sick?" She patted his hand and managed a smile. Even though the baby was still squirmed, even though the shed was dark and gloomy, even though the ache of her missing husband still squeezed her heart, they had made it. "I just need to rest is all," she said, leaning against a table leg. Her eyes blinked closed, and she allowed herself some moments of exhausted sleep. The next thing she heard, the door was opening. Chapter 1. September. As the hired bridal coach bumped across Bleecker Street from St. John's Church, Hypatia pulled aside the window curtain. Her classmates from Miss Manahan's Female Institute fluttered from the school and raced next door to greet her at her new home. One of the tallest girls cradled Hypatia's gray school frocks and dashed up the front stairs of the Galway house ahead of a second student who carried the quilt in which Hypatia had bundled her meager possessions. At the front entranceway, Miss Manahan herself stood in her charcoal dress and white cap, her face pale, spine straight, and carrying a look of satisfaction. Waiting behind her stood a middle-aged black woman with a curious expression. Hypatia recognized her as the servant she had noticed bustling in and out of the house. It struck her that the woman was now her servant, and that she had no idea how to manage their relations. She let the curtain drop and closed her eyes. Please, God, she prayed, show me the right way to handle her. Her husband, Augustine, slipped his arm around her waist. Don't linger with your friends, my dear, he said. The stagecoach will not wait for us. Get changed and come right back to me. He leaned in and kissed her cheek, his salt and pepper beard soft against her skin. His lips touched her ear. I want to be in Albany by nightfall. A spasm of fear and anticipation streaked through her. He opened the door and stepped out, wincing a bit as he flexed his knee. On his arm, she passed up the bluestone walkway, smiling stiffly at the girls, each holding a sprig of rosemary to ward off bad luck. At the door, he released her and pulled Miss Manahan aside. As Hypatia looked over her former classmates, she saw happiness and jealousy both. If only Mama were here to help sort it all out, she thought. Mr. Galway's words, instruct her, reached her ear, and she saw Miss Manahan nod. I'm Maggie, missus, said the black woman, bowing her head. The cook here, but I ain't always in that kitchen. We're glad to have some new life in here. Thank you, said Hypatia. Mr. Augustine said I gotta help you get ready. I'm sure I can manage. Mr. Augustine says help, said the cook, winking. So I'm gonna help. Miss Manahan pulled her away and guided her into the house. Hypatia looked over her shoulder. An audible sigh of disappointment came from the girls. I am a wife now, she thought. The idea still didn't feel right, even though she'd been repeating the sentence since her marriage service. She gazed around the 2-story tall foyer. A grand staircase with dark cherry wood steps and a curving banister ran up the right side. The polished floors were lined with oriental rugs. Augustine was at her elbow. It's very big, she said. He gestured toward the portraits lining the walls. These are my ancestors. The paintings were brought to America by my father. I want you to think of them as your new family. The eyes of history seemed to be staring down at her with disapproval. As her glance bounced from one stern face to the next, she knew they would never replace her mama and her papa, even though her parents had left her alone in this world when they departed so suddenly for the next. At the bottom of the staircase hung a depiction of a grand lady. On a small brass plaque, she read the name Mrs. Emma Galway. She already knew about the late Mrs. Galway, of course. During their month-long courtship, Augustine had spoken about her in the highest terms. As he did, Hypatia secretly winced. She studied the painting, wanting to dislike her, but Emma's intelligent blue eyes seemed to gaze at her kindly, and her gold ringlets framed her face perfectly, and her creamy shoulders disappeared so discreetly into a handsome emerald dress that all she could do was envy her. I will never live up to such a lady, she thought. In the bedchamber, as Maggie assisted her out of her borrowed white and blue frock and into a new auburn silk dress, a gift from Mr. Galway, she watched Miss Manahan pace. Of course, said the schoolteacher began, normally your mother would ready you for what is to come, but it has fallen to me to tell you. The older woman looked up at the ceiling as if for divine inspiration. A woman's happiness depends entirely on her husband, so your job is to be pleasing, to care for him, and to prepare for children. Hypatia opened her mouth, but Miss Manahan stopped her. Mr. Galway is a man of experience, of worldly experience. He will guide you in the particulars. Maggie caught her mistress's eye. Don't worry, every bride's got to go through it. Several days later, as the newlywed couple were breakfasting in their honeymoon suite in New York City, Hypatia caught a beautiful dash of color past the window. She squinted. No ship mast could be that high over the East River. She stood to get a better view. "Please sit down, my dear," said her husband. "We don't want you to upset your digestion." "But look," she said, throwing her napkin down and rushing to the window. A wondrous white and green striped air balloon rose in the sky. A net of ropes surrounded the sphere and held a sizable passenger basket swinging below, trailing multicolored ribbons. Augustine joined her, and he rested his hand on her shoulder while they both watched the strong breeze blow the contraption across the river. She smiled back at him, and a moment of acknowledgement passed between them. Without me, she thought, he might never have noticed it. When the servant answered her summons, he explained that the balloon belonged to the aeronaut Monsieur Louis Laurent, and that he was expected to return and land at Castle Gardens at 10 o'clock that morning. "Walk straight down Broadway, ma'am. You can't miss it," said the man. Bright with excitement, she again turned to her husband. Seated back at the table, he snapped open that day's copy of the New York Spectator. "May we go?" she asked. "I must be at my business." "Look right here," said Augustine, pointing to a stock price list. "Mohawk rail stocks have dropped $1.50. Who knows how far they'll fall this morning?" Sometimes he seemed so incurious, so ready to dismiss the wonders of New York or anything that kept him away from business as a distraction. On their first day in the city, he appeared to grow bored at a zoological exhibition with animals from Africa. He grunted non-committally as they viewed jaguars and lions, llamas and parrots, even when they stood before a cage containing two powerfully built hyenas, whose intelligent black eyes watched Hypatia's every movement, and who stalked the edge of their enclosure as if looking for a way to get at her. He had shrugged. When the keeper announced that he would enter their cage, she grasped her husband's arm, alarmed at the thought of seeing the poor man torn to shreds. Augustine claimed that the animals must be toothless, before hustling her away. She never did find out what happened. "You traded stocks every day," she said, as she watched the balloon grow smaller on its way east. "Please, just 1 hour." He appeared to be about to refuse, when instead he closed the newspaper, slapped his hands to his thighs, and agreed. The great pinkish sandstone waters of Castle Gardens reflected in the bumpy waters of New York Harbor. The balloon descended, hovering over the circular building like an enormous flower. Great crowds of people ran across the footbridge to the renovated fort to congratulate the father and son who had made the astounding journey from the tip of Manhattan to Flushing and back again. As Hypatia started to join them, Augustine snatched her arm. "I have indulged you," he said. "It's urgent I go back to the exchange." Her hands dropped, and the delighted expression fell from her face. "I'm sorry," she said, turning away, hiding the tears that had sprung unbidden to her eyes. He took her hand. "I don't mean to be harsh," he said, rubbing his thumb over her wedding ring, "but I've got to go. I'll accompany you back to the hotel." When he returned late in the afternoon, his face was bright with rage. "Two reputable stock dealers failed today. They were so leveraged and deep into railway stocks that when the prices fell, they couldn't pay their debts. It was pandemonium." He collapsed into his chair, head in his hand. "I'm so sorry," she said, kneeling at his side. She had no idea how much he was actually worth. Miss Manahan had said he was wealthy. Did he lose everything? She leaned back on her ankles, suddenly cold. "Are you bankrupt because of me?" "Don't be foolish. Next time I say I have business, do me the courtesy of believing me." He stood up and left the suite. For the next 5 hours she could not settle. She felt guilty about the outing, and as it got later and later, certain that he had abandoned her or was somehow planning to send her back to Miss Manahan. A bell from nearby Trinity Church marked each quarter hour, reminding her of her folly. Why did I insist on seeing the balloon? Would it have been so bad to stay in and done needlework? She looked out the window across the dark water. Shouts on the street below terrified her. What happens if he doesn't want me anymore? To be alone in such a place without even the money to return to Utica. Exhausted and hungry, she finally retreated to her bed. As she lay, eyes open in the dark, trying to ignore the tangle of fearful thoughts, she heard the doorway open, hallway door opened. Heavy steps came toward her room. She scrunched down and pulled the blankets up to her nose. The door opened. Light from the parlor outlined Augustine's silhouette. He crawled into her bed on his hands and knees. Finally, he kissed her on the forehead, patted her cheek, and fell on his back. The smell of spirits and tobacco wafted from his clothing. He began to snore. Anger and frustration burned in her belly. I'm nothing to him, she thought. He doesn't even care about my feelings. Perhaps that's how it worked. He certainly considered the first Mrs. Galway good enough. She rolled away from him, wiping her tears on the pillowcase. There must be something I can do to prove myself worthy of his consideration. She resolved that no matter how difficult, she would make herself a better wife than Emma Galway. Chapter 2. On the first morning of her first full day in her husband's house, Hypatia slid her hand down the smooth cherrywood banister of the grand staircase. She liked how the polished wood felt warm under her fingertips, and how her pale hand contrasted with the rich maroon stain. At the bottom of the stairs, she nodded to Mrs. Galway's portrait. Apologies, my dear lady. Today I begin to push you out of his thoughts. The previous night, after the arduous journey back to Utica, Augustine had gotten word that he must attend a meeting and had instructed her not to wait up. Instead, he had said, come straight to the library first thing in the morning. So strange. It was as if he loved to keep her in suspense, testing, as if testing her rather than simply saying what he thought. A burst of conversation came from the room to her right. She had knocked on the door before remembering that Miss Manahan instructed her charges to compose themselves before entering a room so as not to bring any excited emotion inside. Come, said her husband's voice, commanding. She yanked the door open so fast that she stood on its threshold on her tiptoes. On the far wall, rows and rows of books sat neatly arranged on shelves that ran the entire length and height of the room. He had called this his library, but she never expected to see so many hundreds of volumes in one place. Africa, said Augustine. Augustine was saying to a handsome stranger, is their natural homeland. Once the Negroes understand what the Colonization Society offers in Liberia, they will be glad to go. The man rose to his feet, his fingers stroking an exquisitely trimmed blonde beard. He let his eye travel over Hypatia as if she were a confection in a shop window. Her stomach tightened, and the sting of blush made her eyes snap to the ground, then dart back, only to see that he still gazed at her openly. It was not proper to stare. Why was Augustine letting it happen? My dear, what are you wearing? Said her husband. She saw that his right leg was wrapped in bandages and elevated on a pillow-covered footstool. What happened? She said, rushing to his side and reaching out to touch the leg. Leave that alone, Mrs. Galway, said the blond man. Hypatia pulled her hand back obediently. She turned to Augustine. Surely it would be rude to demand to know who the man was, but wasn't it up to the husband to make introductions? Oh, Dr. Corliss McCook, said Augustine, Mrs. Galway, and so on. He waved his hand through the air. Don't worry about the leg. It's only broken. Dr. McCook happened by and helped me home. You must be in terrible pain, she said, touching his arm. Don't trouble yourself. He patted her hand. It's nothing, and the doctor is seeing to it. Hypatia's eyes met the doctor's, but again she found his gaze so penetrating that she felt exposed and looked away quickly. If you say so. Now, my little one, don't you like your clothes? You picked out some beautiful gowns from New York. Why wear that old school dress when you could be so lovely? Her hand rose to her collar and touched her own stitching. I was not expecting company. Company? I didn't buy these dresses for company. I bought them because you're now my wife. His voice softened. You are the lady of the house. Your appearance reflects on me. Of course, she said. I'll go change, if you'll excuse me. And see Maggie. She's readying the spare room for the doctor and needs help with the shopping. She'll tell you where to go. Is Dr. McCook staying here? He has graciously agreed to lodge with us until I am well. I am at your service, said Dr. McCook, bowing slightly, a smile raising on his lips. You see, I found him after he had fallen off his horse. Luckily, I arrived a few minutes before the 3 a.m. coach made a meat pie out of him. Never mind that, said Augustine. Dearest, Mrs. Galway, dearest, as Mrs. Galway, you have new duties. I expect you to take charge of managing the house. Make sure that things run smoothly. I want you to familiarize yourself with the property and Maggie's work. Hypatia bowed her head. Now go about your business, my dear. As she took one last look at the row of books, many more than the meager supply of Miss Manahan's, she heard her husband remark, "Doctor, open up that bottle of brandy, imported from Paris. I purchased an entire case of it." Hypatia closed the door and made her way past the serene face of Mrs. Galway and ran up to her chambers. At the closet, she examined the array of dresses that had been chosen for her by her husband, and whatever seamstress happened to be staffing the various shops that they visited. All of the clothing seemed far too fancy to simply sit around in the house. And what if she ran into one of the girls from school? Might they now think she was putting herself above them? She removed the gray school frock and buried it deep in the closet. A sliver of her mind still believed that her husband might find her unsuitable and send her back to Miss Manahan like a bandy-legged horse. Standing before the mirror of her boudoir table, she held up an ochre-colored gown. It was a fine dress, lovely and soft, with fashionably puffy sleeves. The earthy tone complemented her pale skin and dark hair. A woman should be proud to have such a gown. Mrs. Galway certainly would have been proud. She decided to wear it as if she always dressed that way. As she changed, a rumble of thunder brought her to the window. Rain beat against the pane, distorting everything. Past the shed and the barn, the line of trees at the back of the property bent in the wind. There'd be no leaves after this storm. Lightning flashed, and the crack of thunder sounded as if someone was pounding on the roof. The storm was strong, but there was a sharp line of bright sky in the distance. To go shopping, a married woman had to be dressed appropriately, so she continued until she stood before the mirror again. Her gown was complemented by a dark violet shawl, a high-brim bonnet, and white gloves, the outfit of a proper lady. But in her own eyes, she had no business wearing it. I can't do it, she thought, and a flush of shame climbed up her long neck, crept over her two round cheeks, clambered past her brown eyes and dark brows, and brightened her face all the way to her widow's peak. In the backyard, lightning caught her eye. She counted. 1. The thunder. The strike was so close, had the barn been hit? She gazed across the yard at the circle of outbuildings. No tree had fallen, but the shed door was open. It had been closed a moment ago. She supposed that this was this was the sort of thing that Augustine expected her to care about when he had said she should take charge. Oh, why wasn't there a manservant in the house to send out to check? Hypatia went down the tight servant stairs into the warm kitchen and lingered at the back window of the shed. All seemed perfectly normal now. Door closed, nothing wrong. No reason to bother Mr. Galway with this. He and the doctor seemed to be settling into drinking brandy this morning. She supposed that despite his denial, he must be in some pain. Now was not the time to trouble him with something she could see to herself. And to ask Dr. McCook? No, she wanted nothing to do with him. Lightning flickered. She counted. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Thunder. The clatter of the rain on the roof slowed, as if God had simply moved his water jug to some other spot. The storm was moving off. She took a deep breath before plunging into the backyard. Light rain landed on her face as she marched to the shed. The iron handle was in place, but she still pushed inside. The room brightened and darkened as clouds pushed by high winds in the upper atmosphere, streaked across the sky. A few shafts of light fell on cobwebs that stretched from the low ceiling to the tools and baskets. All seemed empty. Hypatia turned to leave, but suddenly, among the dusty rakes, ropes, and water cans, she saw a pair of eyes. A woman, her huge belly jutting out from a small frame, sat on the ground. Hypatia was so stunned that she did not fully understand what she was seeing, as the woman and watched as the woman struggled to her feet. She used an old hay fork like a cane, raising herself upright. Her shawl had fallen down her arms and dangled to the dirt floor. Her tan blouse exposed her throat and drooped with dampness. Her skin, the color of newspaper left too long in the sun, was heavily freckled, and her face was round as a casserole dish. The skirt she wore was torn in places, gathered high above her round stomach, and hung limply. The woman's pregnant belly fought her attempts at balance, pulling her spine this way and that. As soon as she stood, she pushed a small boy behind her. He, too, was soaking wet, his straw hat sagging. Hypatia's mouth hung open. A wave of fear rushed through her. "Who are you?" she stammered. "My name's Amari, ma'am. Me and Joe here's just trying to get out of the rain." Suddenly she clutched her stomach and groaned. The hay fork fell to the ground. Her knees bent. She teetered, neither really standing nor truly falling. "Mama!" cried the boy. He tried to support her, but she slipped through his arms. Hypatia rushed to the woman as she lay on the damp dirt floor. "Is the baby coming now?" she asked. "I'm going to go get a doctor." She started to rise. The woman grabbed her arm, nails digging through the sleeve into her flesh. "Don't!" she cried. "I just need to rest a while. You'll see. Don't bring no one else out here. I'll come right."